daringly keeps to push the envelope, and all the time Yahweh says he would not destroy them. Then chapter 19, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose and he met them and bowed himself to them. Lot sitting in the city gates meant he was likely one of the elders of the city. That was the point of where the city leaders would sit. They would monitor everybody coming in and out, avoiding or identifying threats, eliminating them, and the people felt security. But here Lot bows down to him as if he's seeing something. He's recognizing them. There's a connection there, that this is not just the average person. And he says, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. And then you may rise up early morning and go on your way." And they said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside and finally came to his house. And this is what we find in what we talked about earlier, what was going on there in Sodom. But we find the men of Sodom, both young and old, all of the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" Again, we see this aggressive behavior in seeking a relationship with these men. And the fact that he says that we may know them, that is sexual, referring to sexuality. Yes. Yep, that's exactly right. And what does Lot do? We think it is absolutely heinous what he does. He offers his daughter, says she has not slept with anyone, and you can do with her whatever you want. Just leave these men alone. Well, to understand that scenario, we have to understand the culture again. And it's actually still in Palestine. I don't know about Israel so much, but the Palestinians, definitely. That is the culture. We have a good friend who ministered to, what's his name? Yasser Arafat. For many years, he would sit across his table from him and tell him the good news of the gospel. And he figures Yasser was a believer. Yeah. Pardon? In the end, yeah. But this is what they would do. If a stranger came into the house of your house, you became responsible for that stranger. And even if this is in Yasser's own words, even if a murderer comes into my house, I would give my life before I would hand him over to law enforcement. It's a shame on me in my house to hand a guest over to another for punishment. Absolute shame. You never do that. As soon as he steps across the threshold, he's all yours. But as long as he's in my house, that will never happen. And seemingly that is what's going on here with Lot. It looks very harsh, but he's doing whatever he can to divert the mob. And again, why, if Lot had not been in this kind of relationship with the mob, so to speak, how did he escape? Like, they were overpowering him and they were overpowering the house. It looks like there was no stopping them, barring a divine action. So how did he escape? Or again, was it the divinity that they were after? And if it was the divinity they were after, then we can see where the relationships in Genesis 6 was very much in corresponding to what was going on here. And especially if the region was descendants of those relationships. wanting sexual relations with strange flesh, like Jude tells us. It is hard to understand, but there seemingly that was the mindset, and this is what was going on. And of course, in verse 11, chapter 19, we see that they were struck with blindness, and the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they themselves wore out groping for the door. Also significant, theological messaging. Sin, wickedness, is in fact blindness, right? And he is giving them their own reality. They think they can see, but they're actually blind. Lay down probably to sleep. Yeah. Yes, before they lay down, likely because they were spending the night there, right? Before they lay down to sleep, yeah. And that's when the men of the city stormed the house and all this transpires. And the angels, or the men, that's how they're mentioned here, said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, daughters, anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place." Again, we see the mercy of God. Lot himself is being saved on account of Abraham. And he's willing to save Abraham's family on account, or Lot's family on account of Lot. It's the mercy of God reaching even beyond what Abram was challenging him with. Will you really destroy the wicked with the righteous? And if there's relationship, if there's family members, also depicting the church in one sense, we are members of one God. And in the morning they urge Lot to leave. And here we have a picture of what the sovereignty of God does. This is what you would call an act in the Hiffiel term, a causative action. Verse 16, even though he said they were supposed to leave, but he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. It's like LaDawn often does to me. Here, let me help you. No, she doesn't. But leave. But they didn't understand. I really don't think they quite understood the significance of this. And they physically take him and set him outside. And what is Lot's plea? Let me go to a city, just a little one. First of all, they're supposed to go into the hills, and he says, no, that won't work. But I know of a little place, and he literally calls it is a little one, likely referencing into wickedness is much less there. The whole idea of cities seemingly is not God's idea, but rather man's idea. And seemingly where the cities are and they grow, wickedness grows with it. Yeah, verse 20, where, behold, the city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. So the angel says, escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until I arrive there. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. So we have this picture of destruction coming, but only as far as Zoar. And that's where Lot is placed. Now I actually have a video, but we won't go there, but you can actually look it up yourself. It's called, what's the guy's name again? I'm so good with names. He's Ron Wyatt. Ron Wyatt is just an average guy back in 1977, in there, 1975. But he's worth looking up. He's not a journalist or anything. He's just a guy who's interested. And he's not an archaeologist. But him and his sons, they go to these regions, and they're curious about, they have questions about the validity of the Bible. Is there Noah's Ark? Where is Sodom and Gomorrah? All these questions. And where is the crossing of the Red Sea? Well, he's documented everything in process. It's not in hindsight that he's put it together. He filmed himself while he was searching for this. And as I say with confidence, he has found the Ark. He has found Sodom and Gomorrah. He has found the Red Sea crossing. And he has found the grain bins of Joseph, of Egypt. Yep. And it is fascinating to watch. It looks very ancient. The film, it's not by no means the best at all, but it is enough that you can follow and you can actually see. And he's filming on site, and it is fascinating to watch. And I would strongly encourage you at some point, have a look at it. It really helps actually in reading the text and what has been there, because there's so much correlation. And of course, there's sulfur and raining down on Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying it, sulfur and fire. And one of the things he discovered, he's found rocks, and they're pitted rocks, like holes in there. There's filled up, but when he chips away the edge, there's tons of them. There's a little pebble of sulfur in there, in the middle of it. He said when it rained down, as soon as it started closing up, it snuffed out the heat, and the little bit of sulfur remained. But he's found lots of them. It's absolutely fascinating. There's no reason why they should be there. And we see Lot's wife. She looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. That was the end for her. And in verse 29, and so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and set Lot out of the midst of the overflow when he overthrew the cities in which he had lived. Again, Lot was spared on account of Abraham. And Lot went up with his family up into Zoar, and then obviously, seemingly, they moved out into the caves there. And his daughters say in verse 32, "Come, let us make our father drink wine, that we may lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." And that's where we get Moab and the Ammonites from. These nation groups. They are direct descendants of Lot's misbehavior. That could be. That could be. Well, Lot's wife is gone. I don't know how many people actually came out of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah. Say again. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So many probably did not go with him and were destroyed as a result. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good observation. Chapter 20, we have Abram in the land in the Negev. It's southern in this region here. And he meets Abimelech. Abimelech is just a name of a position, like the Pharaoh. It is a king in the region. And again, he has Sarah lie about the relationship. And again, when they find out, the king is upset, of course, and Abram comes away with a lot of possession. As we see in chapter 20, verse 14 and down. Abimelech took sheep, oxen, male servants, female servants, on and on and on. And look at the price that he pays for Sarah's innocence. In verse 16, to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. That is, 1,000 shekels is paid as a restitution fee. It's more than the average worker would make in a lifetime. So you have a little bit of a framework of what he was willing to part with to save his own skin and to spare shame on Sarah and Abram. Chapter 21, we have the birth of Isaac, and of course he is circumcised on the 8th day. And Sarah's response is, God has made laughter of me. Everyone who hears of this will laugh over me. And in verse 21:8, and the child grew and was weaned, and Abram made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw son of Hagar in Egypt, Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abram, laughing. So she said to Abram, cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with the son of Isaac. And this was very displeasing to Abram on account of his son. But God said to Abram, be not displeased because the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And Paul seems to find this to be very important to actually quote Sarah's words in Galatians 4:21. But here we have two, in Galatians it is two covenants. One is Mount Sinai and one is Mount Galatians 4:21. Let's look it up. If you find it, read it. Go ahead, continue reading. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Correct. It's standing for two covenants, one again from Mount Sinai and one from heavenly. And we see that kind of principle. There's first Adam from the earth, God, the second Adam from heaven. One is through a promise, one is through natural descent. And again, like Peter N says, it is by promise. And God allows circumstances to be such that if he doesn't do it sovereignly, it cannot be done. Because he's making the point, it comes through a promise. God alone gets the credit. Absolutely. And it's through Isaac that your offspring shall be named. So Abram arose early in the morning, this is verse 14, and took the bread and skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. That was an act of divorcement. She could no longer be a part of the family, and therefore Ishmael could not be an heir. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And again, of course, Hagar is very down, and she leaves her son to die, but God comes to her, and it says, I will make him into a great nation. We find that in verse 18. Lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then the Lord opened her eyes, and she saw water and everything, and he provided for her and the child that they may live. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and we see that cry from Abel. We see that cry from Israel. We see that cry coming up from the ground. Yeah, and God responds to it. Yeah. And then we have a short story of the treaty with Abimelech, where he is actually recognizing Abram as a blessed man of God, and again gives him sheep and oxen. Abram took the sheep and oxen, gave them to Abimelech and the men who made the covenant. And Abram set 7 ewe lambs of the flock. And Abimelech said to Abram, what is this meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I will have dug this well. And it's the place of Beersheba, which literally means the well of 7, or 7 wells. And again, Abraham does not assume, it's all in this region here, and he doesn't assume that a gift of any sort is he seems to avoid receiving a gift, but he prefers to pay for it. It's a done deal. He's making his home in the land. He's putting his foot in the land. He's claiming it as his own, following in the promise of God to him. Chapter 21, we have the sacrifice of Isaac. And after these things, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, did I say 21? Chapter 22, verse 1. And he said to him, here am I. And he said, take your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that which I will tell you. Now we know that the mountain is Mount Moriah, and all history tells us it is the mount of the temple, or at least in that region, in the same region. So the offering of Isaac is really a picture of what the Messiah will do in coming to offer himself. And the burnt offering was an offering that is without blemish. It is cut up completely and burnt. That's one aspect of it, and it's very often in at making atonement or sacrifice as for forgiveness, that kind of thing. And on the third day, Abram lifted up his eyes, and he saw the place from afar. And Abram, verse 6, and Abram took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon his son Isaac, and off they went. Where else do we see that concept of the wood being placed on the back of the one who will be offered? Yes, Christ himself. It very much depicts that scenario. We have Isaac and Jesus, both born of a promise, right? Um, both of them carry their source of death on their backs. Pardon me. He assumes. He has enough faith to go, I will offer him, and I presume, actually I think Hebrew tells us that he will bring him back from the dead. Yeah, exactly. And Hebrew, I think, says that he presumed that God would raise him up from the dead and they would go back. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Second Chronicles 3:1 identifies the site of Mount Moriah as the Jerusalem temple, the site of the Jerusalem temple. It's not certain, but it's in the region, and very likely it could even be on the very hill which the Christ was crucified. Yes, that's seemingly what Chronicles points out to, but Christ was crucified outside the camp, outside the city walls, so yeah. And in verse 12 of chapter 22, he said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy." This is after putting him on an altar, "or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have withheld your son, your only son, from me." Now, the only son concept we can be seen in two ways. Um, Ishmael was clearly a son of Abraham, hands down. Was it due to the fact that he divorced Hagar and therefore no longer a legitimate son, which made Isaac the only son? Or the concept in the original language seems to be the same as John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. That word begotten means one of a kind. And that's not so many years ago even that was the idea of the Greek word was changed from he was begotten or he came to be, rather he was one of a kind. And the Hebrew language, it looks very, very close, those two words, but they're quite convinced it is actually means one of a kind. And I think many actually new translations show that. So again, going back to the sons of God, Jesus was one of a kind. And here Isaac is one of a kind. What kind? He was a son of promise. And all of Israel is hinged on the fact that God fulfilled his promise in bringing a son to Abraham and Sarah. And in verse 14, so God called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day." So obviously, this writer wrote it this part at least significantly later, and referencing that, I guess Moses in the desert, this happened way back. But this tradition, what happened here, was carried out from generation to generation, to where Moses says, "It is still said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And then we have the final words that God speaks to Abraham. In verse 17, he says, "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of the enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations," again the Gentiles, "of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Then we see that Sarah dies, and Abraham purchased some land in Egypt, or in Israel, in the land of Israel, Canaan at the time. And he pays 400 shekels of silver for the property in verse 14 of 23. Now the caves where they were buried is interesting, because there's shelves in these caves, and they would take the body and they would lay it on one of these shelves, and the body would deteriorate. And when there was only the bones left, they would collect them and very often put them in a box called a bone box, and they would set them in the back of the cave. And all the family would now have this grave. They would, as soon as Abram died, he gets buried in the same grave. And the process continues. And that's the significance that we see that Jesus was the first one. He was in a new cave. And if that cave is, or if that burial place is empty, that means he rose from the dead. There was no mistaken. Then in chapter 24, we have Isaac and Rebekah, where Abram sends his servant back to Mesopotamia to go get a son or a bride for his son. And interestingly enough, we find that Abram and Jacob, both of them at some point leave the land of Canaan. And Isaac is the only one that actually stays. And we have to ask, why might that be? I personally think it is direct relation to he is the promised child, and it is very much connected to the land of the promise of the land itself. And we see in verse 6 where Abram says, "See that you do not take my son back there. Do not take my son out of the country." Yep. So in verse 14, the servant goes and he says, "Let the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels also." The common practice was asking a binary question of the gods, or in this case, Yahweh. And usually, the unlikely event would be, if that got answered correctly, that would be a yes. And the more natural event, more common, it would be a no. And here, to ask a woman, or a woman that would want to water a bunch of camels, for example, a camel who had not drank for a couple of days could take up to 25 gallons of water per camel, and likely he had many of them. That could be a strenuous effort for a young woman. So the unlikely event, that's what he's asking for. If this woman says, "I will give you drink and water my camels also," I'll take that as this is the one. And that's exactly what happens. And again, he ends up in Laban's house, Rebekah's house, with Laban, who is her brother, and they sit down and have a meal again. And the whole idea of communion, there is peace between them, there's acceptance, and that is always shown in food. Verse 23, "Then food was set before them, but he said to them, I will not eat until I have said what I have to say. And they said, carry on." And he tells them the whole story of Abram. And first of all, he's boasting about Abram, likely ensuring the family that your daughter will be in good hands. That was a very much a concern. And then 42 and down, we see the servant recounts the story of how he met Rebekah, just retelling the story of the well thing. And they were all convinced, yes, this thing must be from the Lord. And in verse 56, he says, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me on my way that I may go to my master." And they said, "Let us call the young woman and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will go." And the end of 24 there, we see that she actually meets up with Isaac, and they are married. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They did not need to. No. Exactly.
Of a future wife, and he's the one who goes to her family, and here we have a reversal of that situation where now the wife is being taken to Abraham's household.
Yes, without being pregnant.
Without,
Yep.
without
That is the unique issue here. Yep. Yeah. Very often they would go and they would have relations, and the woman would stay with her parents until she became pregnant, and that was a sure sign that she would be accepted and looked after within the family, because she now bore an heir. Yeah. That's good, Jared. Thank you. In chapter 25, we have Abram took another wife. This is after Sarah had died. He took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore sons, and Joshak, Medan, Midian, and so on. But what the author highlights is the sons of Midian. And later we find Joseph being sold, and it's one text says Ishmaelites, another says the Midianites. They actually take him to Egypt and sell him there. But the Midianites lived in this region right here. If this is the Red Sea, it looks like more like a chicken bone. But this is where the Midianites lived. Yeah. And if this is Egypt, and I won't steal from Jer's lecture, but that'll give you a little framework of, we know where Moses went after and that whole process. But Jer will likely talk about, but he highlights the Midianites. They're actually descendants of Abraham, and so there is family relation there. The very ones who come and take Joseph to Egypt. And Jacob, upon his death, Abram gave all he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abram gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his sons Isaac eastward to the east country. So Abram's sons moved in this direction, one of them being the Midianites, and he gave everything to Isaac. But what is unique here is that he actually gave gifts to the sons of the concubines. That was shows of his compassion. He had a heart. That was not a cultural thing to do ever. Verse 7, Abram's life was 175 years, and he died. And then we have a short introduction to the generations of Ishmael, and the fact of the 12 princes coming from him, who turned to be 12 tribes. And verse 25:19, we have the generations of Isaac. These are the generations of Isaac. And again, Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Again, this cyclical pattern over and over again. The whole process from beginning in is an act of God. It's a sovereign act of God. It is through divine promise. And when Rebekah finally conceived, the children struggling within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is it happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. The 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And here again we have this pattern which I was referencing. Possibly Cain and Abel was already the pattern set in place where the elder would serve the younger, even though he didn't physically in that place, but the elder was cursed, so to speak, and the younger was blessed. And the same picture we have here. And Esau ends up selling his birthright to Isaac, to Jacob. Isaac is deceived. And again in chapter 26, verse 1, now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine. And the Lord appeared to him and said, go down to Egypt, dwell in the land of which I tell you. Sojourn in this land, do not go down to Egypt, and dwell in this land that I will tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. And later we find that during the famine, in verse 12, we see Isaac sowed in the land and reaped the same year 100-fold. The Lord had truly blessed him. Again, divine intervention. And the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. And Isaac again experiences, like his father, the quarrel over water, over the wells with Abimelech. And they make a covenant, and in verse 28, and they said, we plainly see that the Lord has been with you. This is Abimelech talking to Isaac. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now blessed of the Lord. So he made a feast with them. Again, we have the food aspect of making a covenant. And in verse 34, Esau was 40 years old, and he took Judith, the Hittite. He married Hittite women, and I think the author is simply pointing out the direction of the 2 boys. There's Jacob, who stays in the land, and Esau, who is already marrying into foreigners. Chapter 27, verse 1, we see Isaac. He blesses Jacob. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, and he calls his son, make me food, da-da-da-da. And Rebekah prompts Jacob to go get something from the flock, and this whole deception process is in play, where Rebekah and Jacob deceive their father in order for Jacob to get the blessing. Yeah, he made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. No, they did not approve of marrying the foreigners around them. Yeah, because they knew exactly that would happen. Yeah, and that's why Jacob was sent back to Mesopotamia to their family, Laban, to go get a wife later on.
Will turn you away
Yeah.
from the Lord your God. And you have all these instances of intermarriage throughout the book of Genesis that leads people away from God. And there's a pattern that Moses does not want the Israelites, when they enter the land, to fall back into.
Preserving a line of faith.
Preserving a line of faith.
Exactly. So we find the blessing in chapter 27, verse 28. May God give you the dew of heaven. This is Isaac blessing Jacob. The fatness of the earth, the plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. Again, the blessing of the promise to Abram gets passed down to Isaac. And even though Isaac trembles violently when he learns about it, and Esau comes and begs for a blessing, but as we see in 39, there is no turning back. It is a done deal. And in fact, he says, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. Be your sword, by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. When you grow restless, you shall break the yoke from his neck." So there is a time when his yoke will be broken from the neck of Jacob, and we will talk about that later in 49, I believe. I will reference back to this. And we see Jacob's life being threatened, and that's when they send him off to Laban, back into Mesopotamia. I think this will be good for today. It is almost 9 o'clock. Any questions, thoughts? It's quite dry material in my opinion, but we said we go through Genesis. Still profound. Yeah. Yeah. And you really want to pick up on the little things, the fact that the women are barren, the fact that it is the younger serving, or the elder serving the younger. All of these things depict another reality of of the larger story. And you want to pick up on those things and place them in the right perspective, and just watch it unfold as God is moving his promise forward to accomplish what he said he would. Yeah. All right. Frank Friesen, would you pray for us?
Heavenly Father, we just come before you here this evening, Lord, and we just thank you, Lord, that we can gather here in this manner. We thank you that Isaac made it here to give us some more insight into Genesis. We just thank you for all that, Lord, and we just pray as we go from here, Lord, that you go with each one of us, and that you would just bless Isaac for what he is doing. I just pray all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Appreciate it.